Do you own a 300 or 310? Well, here's your Eaton Supercharger. Let's check it out. When the Ultra 300 was released in 2011, this supercharger was the first of its kind to ever be used in a jet ski. This was a modern replacement for the Agora supercharger that was used in the 250 and 260s that was really prone to failure. This is a serious supercharger. It is not your standard off-the-shelf Eaton supercharger. Both Kawasaki and Eaton came together to design something that would take the heat and abuse of being on a jet ski, as well as the sustained high RPM that we all love to do when we're out on the water. This is Eaton's R-Series supercharger. So it was originally designed for high RPM use, so it really was a suitable choice for Kawasaki. Now, Kawasaki actually made some of the components on this supercharger, or Eaton made it for Kawasaki, but Eaton makes the base supercharger, but Kawasaki makes the gear housing here, as well as the pulley and the two ducts. But the gear housing here, which Kawasaki calls the transmission, is really a pretty remarkable setup. It actually increases the drive ratio to 2:1. So that means for every engine revolution, this is spinning twice. Well, I mean, the rotors are spinning twice. So for every engine revolution, it's sucking in twice the amount of air as it normally would, which is absolutely wild. This thing is moving a lot of air volume. We're gonna go over what to replace, what not to replace, at what interval you should replace it, and what interval you should service the supercharger at. There's a ton of aftermarket supercharger rebuild kits on the market. And all of these rebuild kits have one thing in common. They don't know this supercharger. That's a big problem. They might know an R-Series supercharger, but they don't know this Eaton supercharger that was made by both Kawasaki and Eaton. This has specific components in it that a normal supercharger doesn't. And all these kits that you see all over the internet don't satisfy the components of this specific supercharger. So we want to give you the correct information on what parts to service in here, what parts not to service in here. A lot of the kits come with bearings that you shouldn't need to replace, or that are near impossible to replace. So we're gonna go over all that stuff in this video, and hope you guys stay tuned. The first thing we wanna do is remove the pulley on the front of this supercharger. And we're gonna use a number 5 Allen key to remove these cap screws on an impact driver. You wanna be really careful. If these bolts are really rusty, you're gonna wanna hammer this in like that until it bottoms out, because if you strip that bolt, it's gonna be a pain in the ass to get out. So let's pull these out. Alright, now this pulley can be a pain to get off. So if it's rusty and swollen like most are, you might have to use a steering wheel puller or a bearing puller to get this off. Now, looking at the front of the supercharger here, obviously you got your snout here, your water inlet and outlet, and here is your oil fill plug or your drain plug. So the biggest issue with this is Kawasaki put a tiny little hexen in here. It's made of steel, so you would imagine that it gets locked in here 90% of the time. So unless you ride in fresh water, which fresh water still might be a pain to get out, this is not coming out. So this needs to be drilled out. The good news, we make this beautiful stainless steel plug here that you can get out in and out very easily. We're the only ones in the world that make this beautiful plug like this, so you don't have to screw around anymore if you want to change your oil or do another rebuild. First off, we're going to remove these 6 case bolts here. and they're 12mm hex. Without using any crazy tools here, what we can use to dismantle this transmission here is a block of wood and a hammer. So we're gonna work on this easily. It's not really the right way to do it, but it's something that you all can do without really damaging the housing here. So you see there's tabs up here. We're gonna put the wood behind these tabs here, and we're gonna lightly knock it with the mallet. Okay, that came out off pretty easily. So here, you can get a good look at what this looks like. So, Eaton makes this, Kawasaki makes this. So I already drained this of oil so it didn't make a huge mess, but we still have this part here that we can pull apart. So we're gonna do the same thing, and we're gonna break this apart as well. So now you can get a good look at what this stuff looks like. So we have a bearing here, obviously. Here is Kawasaki's really complicated clutch assembly, which we will go over. And here is one of the reduction gears. There's a bearing in the middle here. This one feels okay, it might just have a little dirt in it. And then this actually moves pretty freely here, and there's two bearings behind here which are really tough to replace, but the main stuff is back here. So really, when we're at this point, I want to go over a couple things. All the rebuild kits out there come with the bearings to replace everything in here. I'm going to tell you right now, the likelihood of these bearings failing are extremely low. It doesn't see seawater, it sees nothing but a cooled oil bath. So realistically, unless water got in here or a bearing somehow is damaged or something of the sort, there should be no reason you should touch anything in here. The main bearings that you should be concerned with are in the back of the supercharger here. They're the 2 needle bearings. They hold up very well, but they do have a lifespan. You should be at least thinking about replacing these rear needle bearings here every 100 to 150 hours, depending on how you ride. When you finally do get around to rebuilding your supercharger, when we install new bearings in here, we are gonna really pack them out with some really high quality grease so they last significantly longer. They don't put a lot of grease on from the factory. They do hold up very well, but we do want to install something that's gonna last even longer. Now look at this housing here, this reduction gear. So there's a bearing in the middle here. It is definitely serviceable. This housing is made by Kawasaki. It has the cooling ports in it, so it cools the gear housing, and it has a bearing in the middle here. This is one of the more difficult bearings to replace because you have to separate the 2 gears and they're pressed together. You have to push this gear on this side out of this one. And in order to do that, there's a high risk of damaging this case here. Even when we do it, there's a high risk. So we recommend don't replace it unless you really have to, because this bearing will last the equivalent of 100,000 miles easily. So we recommend not replacing it. And I say that sounds pretty good and feels pretty good. It just needs a good cleaning. And now, one of the more important parts of the supercharger is the most complex thing I've seen in a while, and I give it to Kawasaki because this thing is really cool. So, obviously you have a bearing in here. This will come out very easily with the collar puller. Here is your damper assembly. So anybody who's done a drive shaft before knows how Kawasaki uses the rubber dampers that kind of go in between the drive shaft that mesh together. Well, they did the same thing in here, and it is freaking cool. So I'm gonna pull this apart so you guys can take a look at it also. This actually prevents damage to the charger. So when you romp on the throttle, the gears aren't smashing into each other like a transmission on a car. So it's, I guess you could say it's kind of like a clutch, but it's a rubber clutch. So it prevents the charger from getting a full beating when you're ripping on the throttle, which most of us are. So I'm going to pull this bolt out so you guys can see how cool this thing is. Okay. So it has this heavy duty washer, this high strength bolt here, and then it has this mesh plate here. Alright, so really cool. Here's your, I guess you want to call it a mesh plate. And here's the little rubber dampers that are in here. Let me pull it out so you can see. So here's the little rubber dampers. How cool is that? Here they are. Here's the mesh plate. Cool. And here's the little rubber dampers. Really cool. Now that these are removed, you want to take a really good look at these rubber dampers to make sure they're not dry rotted. You want to make sure that this mesh plate looks good, as well as the inside here. These look really good. Don't forget these are submerged in oil, so eventually they will break down and there is no replacement for them. Now we're going to pull off this assembly here. So you can see there's a bearing in here, which is replaceable. Feels good, so it doesn't need to be replaced. We recommend not replacing it, but if you want to, you can supply this bearing. There's a washer here. And now there's a plate here that holds this assembly in so it doesn't walk out. So that's in the snout here. So we're going to use the Allen key to remove it. Okay, this retainer is off. The only way to get this out is we have to support the snout here, and we're going to push this shaft out of the bearing. And let's go do that now. Alright, now we have all this supported, we're going to push the shaft out. So here's the shaft. Here's the front housing. You can see these two bearings here. This is what it looks like. These two are replaceable. Obviously we don't recommend it. They will last the lifetime of the machine, but they are removable. So to remove this bearing, you have to push this collar out of the shaft. So you need to support this piece here and push on the shaft here to pull this off, and then you can slide the bearing off like that and replace it if you want to. But like I said, not needed to be replaced. The final piece of the puzzle is to remove the Eaton rotor pack out of the Eaton housing. And depending on how old your machine is and if it was used in fresh or salt water, will depend on how easy this is to get out. And let me tell you, it's not easy. So we have to be really careful not to damage anything. First off, just because of the way this one looks, and obviously it was used in salt water, we're going to use some heat, and then we're going to take it from there. This is nice and warm. Now we're going to use our block of wood and hammer and work this out. Right now I'm just using a piece of aluminum just so I really don't damage anything here. You can see how disgusting this is. Look how bad these rotors are. And you can see all the salt water got in here. Coating's coming off, there's debris on here. And most of all, if you can see this here, there's a lot of rust on the shaft here. So what that means, since it's rust on the shaft, that means that water got in the case housing here. But I think with a little polishing, it'll be okay. So, and the needle bearings just fell out of that. If you can see how rusty these needles are. And earlier in the video, we showed that this supercharger moved pretty freely. And you can see how quickly this can lead to failure. It's hard to tell. That's why we do a rebuild at every 100 to 150 hours. So this is the biggest point of concern, is these needle bearings in the back here. This is really what you should be concerned about replacing. These are the most important part of the supercharger, not all those other bearings. This is it right here. So we have high strength improved bearings, and we will pack them with a lot more grease than they came with from the factory. So in here, see the orange seal here? So I'm gonna knock that out with the hammer. Then we have to take the inner race out, and then we have to take the needles out. So I'm gonna do that right now. So we have the screwdriver in between the cage and the seal, and we're just gonna pry this out as easy as possible. You don't have to worry about damaging anything because you're taking the bearing out. We're gonna grab some needle nose pliers and pull this stuff out, and we'll show you what it looks like when it's done. All right, so here, we picked all this stuff out. All the needles came out, the cage is out. You have to break it, unfortunately. And we can see this is an older unit. It has blue dyed grease in here. This is what Eaton was using on some of the older stuff. Now it's a clearish white, I guess, grease they use. So obviously an older unit, not that it matters. You gotta make sure all the needles and all the debris is out of the hole before you use the puller. Okay, so here's the puller. Harbor Freight sells this as a Collet puller set with a slide hammer. We just modified this a little bit. The slide hammer doesn't really pull straight, so we just made this. You have to use a Collet puller. Harbor Freight has them. You tighten the collet, it expands at the bottom of the hole. We're going to heat this up a little bit because it is a very tight press fit, and then we're going to pull this bearing race out. Here it is. We're going to put it in the hole, tighten it until it expands, and then we're going to pull it out. We're just going to put a little tension on here right now. Now, the side that the bearing is coming out of, we're going to heat the back of it. So if you put a lot of tension on here, which is a good amount, and you heat this up, you'll hear like a ding, and that means the bearing's starting to loosen up in the bore. So once we get that, then we can finish the rest. Okay, we got it out. That's what the inner race looks like, and that's out. And here, if you could see, that's what it looks like. You see all the blue goo in there. So, you saw how we disassembled the supercharger. You saw how we removed the needle bearings, which are the most crucial component in the entire thing. You have 3 options as far as kits go from us. The first kit is a very basic kit. Comes with everything you see here, the needle bearings, the oil, the premium grease, and our stainless steel plug, as well as the 2 gaskets you'll need for assembly. That's our basic kit, and that's pretty much what almost all of you are going to need. If you want to take it a step further and you do want to replace those other bearings in the supercharger, we have a full kit. And the full kit includes everything here, plus We have Japanese bearings, which are these, and we have an economy kit as well. This is going to be the same for both kits, but this is going to be different for the economy versus the regular full. These are all Japanese bearings, but we will have aftermarket bearings as well if you want to put them in, just for the sake of cost. We recommend going with the Japanese bearings. Obviously, you're going to need this regardless. This is really where it's at. We did not show installing the needle bearings, but obviously the seal goes up and they go in just like that. Make sure they're just below the surface, just like the old ones were. Pretty straightforward. Fill them both up with grease. Half goes in one, half goes in the other. Very straightforward. Hope you all enjoyed this video. I hope that it showed you how important it is to maintain your supercharger. You don't want this happening to your supercharger. These needle bearings are crucial for standard operation in your unit, and it's the only part of the supercharger that is a wear item. So they should be replaced every 100 to 150 hours. Those of you who didn't have much information before hopefully have enough information now to purchase the correct kit for what you need, and you don't get stuck with some of these aftermarket kits that give you stuff that you don't need. All this stuff we just spoke about today, you could find on a brand new website, cowiperformance.com. Hope you guys liked the video. Catch you later.